Imagine it's patch day, you've read about the upcoming changes, maybe even got to watch some videos on it, and are hyped for the brand new addition to the world of Warcraft. MMOs tend to live off constant updates over time and offering their player bases new and fresh experiences. But sometimes not everything goes to plan. Sometimes it's due to the content in the patch not being what people expected, sometimes the ambitions of the developers were just too big, and sometimes things just go very wrong. And to be clear, it's not the case that all these updates were poorly received by the player base, though if they were, it will certainly impact how they will be ranked. In fact, I'd say some of them are among the most famous updates ever, and people look back to them and say they were amazing moments. It's more that these all just completely broke the game in one way or another. So that's what I want to talk about today. Those moments where testing was done in production, alarm bells would have been ringing at Blizzard headquarters, and for a short while the world of Warcraft ground to a halt. These are what I think were 10 of the most disastrous World of Warcraft updates of all time. But first, a quick word from today's sponsor, Boot.dev. Boot.dev is a platform that aims to equip you with the skills to forge a career in back-end development through interactive lessons and learning. It keeps this learning experience more interactive and goal-driven by bringing in features from RPGs, such as experience, achievements, and even leaderboards to keep you motivated to progress onwards. Boot.dev offers the tools to get fully on board with the Python and Go programming languages. It does this through tons of hands-on learning, where you're going to be writing loads of your own code so that you can get a grasp of the fundamentals from the basics onto more advanced lessons. On top of that, all the content is free to view and watch in guest mode, and there's even a 30-day no questions asked refund policy. So even if you're just interested in checking out how Boot works before you want to commit, there is very much the option to do that. So why not check them out? You can click the link in the description box and use my code Willie to get 25% off your first month, or even your first year if you choose the annual plan. Many thanks to Boot.dev for the sponsor today. Let's get on back to WoW. Starting off, we have the final major content patch of Battle for Azeroth, patch 8.3, Visions of N'Zoth. BFA has gone down over time as being a highly controversial expansion where Blizzard leaned far too heavily into temporary power gains for our characters, and they also focused massively on daily, weekly, and even monthly chores which we had to do in order to stay up to speed with all these expansion-specific systems. Where we started out with just our Azerite armor, then later we had essences added into the mix in 8.2, and it just seemed as though there couldn't possibly be anything else. Well, that would turn out to be very wrong, as in 8.3 Blizzard will bring out arguably the most impactful temporary power gain system ever: corrupted gear. During this final patch, gear had a chance to become corrupted, meaning it could gain a random affix of a certain rank. Corruptions had 3 different ranks too, with 1 being the weakest version of that corruption and 3 the strongest. So to get a properly best in slot item was extremely unlikely. I mean, even getting your best corruption at rank 3 on a piece of gear that you were supposed to be using wasn't that common. And I say the gear you're supposed to be using very much on purpose. I remember watching some of the Race to World first in Ny'alotha the Waking City, and some of the tanks had cloth gear on just because it had Abyss corruption on it, and the power gain from this corruption was so high that it was worth just not even using proper armor. And believe me, corruptions were a very big deal. It's not hard to find DPS meters from back in the day with randomly acquired effects on random bits of gear doing random uncontrolled damage, which contributed more than your entire normal rotation. Simply put, it was proc hell. Also during this patch, bind on equip gear with good corruptions became worth millions of gold, especially if you were on a realm with a highly competitive guild. Part of the Race to World first became how much gold can we launch at getting BIS BOE gear off of the auction house. I'm sure there are people watching this who got a random drop late in BFA and it set them for life for gold on World of Warcraft. To this day, corruptions remain the most impactful random effects on gear we've ever seen, and I don't think we're going to see that change anytime soon. The second big potential problem with this final patch of BFA was story-wise with the N'Zoth fight. N'Zoth have been built up over many years in the WoW universe as the controlling mastermind behind so many different events that had taken place. So when players got to face him, they were expecting an epic encounter, and whilst the fight itself might have been good enough for you, what wasn't good enough for many people was how the boss actually went out. A short cutscene where the player channels a beam into the boss, and then another short cutscene where the boss, explodes, and people complain they didn't get to fight Deathwing in Cataclysm, but this one was on a whole other level. Blizzard even had this video on their official channel for a while, but they ended up unlisting it, meaning you need the link to watch it because it was so poorly received by the community. And then after this, we didn't even know Shadowlands was due to be the next WoW installment. 8.3 will always be a memorable patch, and there was no doubt some fun to be had by just how dumb overpowered corruptions were, and I know a lot of people did like the patch for this reason, as well as the other catch-up systems. But then the Zoth cutscene, definitely I don't think is one to remember, so all in all I think 8.3 deserves a mention on this list. Next up is a patch from the expansion following BFA, the Shadowlands. I don't think it's too much of a surprise to see these two expansions getting a mention during this video, but don't worry, there's definitely going to be a lot of variety, I can tell you that. The patch I'm picking from Shadowlands is the first major content patch, 9.1 Chains of Domination. Following a rough start, Shadowlands was in need of a good first patch to turn things around and win players back to this expansion. 9.1, however, was not going to be that patch. The first thing players got to see in 9.1 was Korthia City of Secrets, which to be honest was rather short on the city part of its name and the secret part too. Instead of a mystical sprawling city or library, it was kind of a rather inconvenient to traverse zone with loads of random stuff to pick up. And there was about half a dozen new currencies or something because Blizzard loves some new currencies in a major patch. Korthia City of Secrets just missed the mark on expectations and ended up just feeling a bit bland and forgettable. In 9.1, Blizzard were also still standing strong on their stance with Covenant, which had been a controversial addition to the game made through Shadowlands. At the start of Shadowlands, you could only pick one Covenant, which would give you certain new abilities, and sometimes these abilities were bis for PvP or PvE or even Mythic Plus, and swapping these Covenants was an extremely lengthy process where basically it just wasn't viable to do unless you were really committed to doing so. The problem was that when players were locked into one Covenant, they were at times missing a vital class ability and just couldn't go and get it, so you were going to perform worse than somebody else of the same class who had picked a better Covenant in a certain area of the game, and people just did not like that at all. In patch 9.1.5, Blizzard would finally cave on this and make Covenant swappable, but it really didn't help the situation in Shadowlands that they didn't want to budge on this for so long. On top of that, the story of Shadowlands heading into its second raid tier, the Sanctum of Domination, was not being that well received either, with Sylvanas and her infinite power trip still being well underway. It's probably one of the moments in WoW's history with some of the highest player dissatisfaction towards the state of the game. It's rare that the new zone, the new story, and the new raid don't go down all that well. It's almost impressive in a way. 9.1 did have Tazavesh, the Veiled Market, as a redeeming moment, but I don't think that was quite enough to salvage the patch as a whole. Next up, we're going all the way back to TBC for a rather less than memorable patch. The super early versions of World of Warcraft tend to get away with having some major content patches that were absolutely dire in retrospect. I guess the World of Warcraft just seemed a whole lot bigger when we all knew a whole lot less about it, but that's not something we can change now. But the patch I want to highlight here is patch 2.2, Voice Chat. You see, TBC was an extremely front-loaded expansion which had all of its dungeons, minus Magister's Terrace, as well as their heroic difficulties, and raiding-wise it had Karazhan, Grul's Lair, Magtheridon's Lair, Serpent Shrine Cavern, Tempest Keep, and Mount Hyjal at launch. Patch 2.1 came along and nerfed pretty much all of that content and brought in the Black Temple, so by patch 2.2, I guess it kind of makes sense that things had slowed down a bit after that insane pace at launch. But what 2.2 brought into the game was voice chat. And I mean, in terms of new content for a major patch, that was basically it. The rest of the patch was rebalancing existing stuff and bug fixes. Imagine a major patch nowadays and it's a singular feature which isn't even any in-game content. Of course, at the time, voice chat options were a lot more limited than Discord, which we're also used to nowadays, so having a good in-game voice chat feature would have been legitimately useful. It is rather a shame then that the voice chat they delivered was bad, like really bad. Poor voice quality, disconnections, and implementation issues in-game meant that the player base never adopted this new system as something that was commonly used, and most people just carried on using Ventrilo as the go-to. Blizzard were even asked about the quality of the voice chat in a dev blog, where they basically said, yeah, it's bad, we need to make it better, and that they'd work on it later. To be honest, I'm not sure if they ever did, because I don't think I've ever met somebody who hasn't used some kind of third-party voice chat chat between one event, Skype, Mumble or Discord, but an entire major patch to be one new feature which didn't even work properly seems pretty bad to me. So that's why patch 2.2 voice chat gets a mention here. Speaking of hey Blizz, where's the content type of patches? Let me introduce you to the first major content patch of Warlords of Draenor, patch 6.1 Garrisons Update. A major patch which was comprised of, are you ready for this? Are you sitting down? It had new Blood Elf models, an Heirloom Collection tab, Twitter integration, and a selfie cam. And that is kind of it. Yeah. So, Warlords of Draenor didn't get off to a good start, more on that later, don't worry, and it was also during 6.1 alongside the fastest subscriber drop-off WoW has ever seen, that Blizzard decided there were better metrics to measure the game's performance by rather than making this information public. Or in other words, saying our game's doing bad isn't good for shareholders, let's not do that anymore. In fact, Warlords of Draenor was so sparse on content that the second major raid tier in Blackrock Foundry was released about 1 month or so prior to 6.1. I don't know if there's ever been another major raid just dropped in between patches ever, and 6.2 with Hellfire Citadel and Tanaan Jungle was the last major content patch, by the way. It's hard to look back and believe just how little Warlords of Draenor had going on content-wise, but 6.1 was the peak of the lack of the new stuff to do in WoW. This was of course on top of all the content that was cancelled for WoD, such as the Zangarmarsh zone, the Netherstorm zone aka Farallon, Karabor, which would become the Black Temple being the capital for the Alliance, and so much more. It must have been difficult as a Blizzard developer to see this patch going live knowing how people would react to it, and it surely marks a low point in the history of World of Warcraft, and for that reason it's making the list here. Next up, we're going back just a little bit more to visit our current classic expansion, Cataclysm. Whilst as a whole Cata generally receives a mixed reception, if there was one patch that people like the least, it will be the final one, patch 4.3, the Hour of Twilight. This was the culmination of the Cataclysm expansion and would finally see us do battle with Deathwing, who had been taunting us for the entire expansion. But similar to 8.3 and with Visions of N'Zoth, when we finally did battle, it just wasn't quite right. The two-part encounter with Deathwing sounds epic on paper, with us jumping from an airship onto his back to destroy his armor, and then finally defeating him once and for all after he crashes into the Maelstrom. But in practice, many people felt as though they never properly fought Deathwing as the big final bad guy of the expansion, and ultimately it just wasn't a satisfying end to the story. This patch also introduced LFR, and Cata looking for raid was kinda built different. Even though it was designed to be an easier and accessible version of raiding, for a lot of people it was their first step into this type of content, and the differing levels of player skill you'd see more or less instantly led to a very toxic raid environment. Also, unlike future versions of LFR, there was no determination stacking, you know, that 5% buff you get when you wipe on something, so you just have to repeat and wipe until the boss died. But of course, if you wipe or it wasn't close to a kill, you get a bunch of people who leave, and then you have to wait for new people to get in and hope that they have some kind of idea what to do on the boss so you could progress. Spoiler alert, they were never any better. It was just a rotating door of random people until you brute forced your way through the raid, which is why I've always found LFR to be a poor substitute for normal organized raiding. But the loot from LFR was still very good, especially weapons, trinkets and tier sets, so you had to go and get it done to aid your guild in progression. Even Paragon, who had earned every world first from Heroic Lich King to Ragnaros, got hit with a ban. They found a loophole where you could see what a boss dropped but not loot it if it's not what you wanted, and then go kill it again and repeat until you get your desired item. I think looking for raid has definitely grown in popularity over time and has improved in terms of balance, as well as being separated from raid releases, but the first iteration of it in Cata was really not that good, and it's funny that Blizzard are delaying LFR in Cata Classic. Maybe they took a look at how it was back then and thought, yeah, we're not putting this back in the game anytime soon, we need to come up with a better idea. Saying this, patch 4.3 definitely had some good content too, such as the 3 new dungeons it introduced, and of course transmogrification, which is probably one of the most single impactful additions to WoW ever. So patch 4.3 in the Hour of Twilight wasn't all good, but it definitely wasn't the best either. Next up is the first expansion launch to take place on this list. Over the years, Blizzard have definitely learned a thing or two about how to get World of Warcraft's massive player base from one expansion over to the next, and these days it tends to be pretty seamless. You log in, a new NPC appears, you talk to them, and that's it, you're in the new expansion. Easy. Back in the day, things were different. See, World of Warcraft had done rather well as a game. I don't think anyone would have guessed by the time its first expansion launched that there would be some 8 million active subscribers. And that means you have up to 8 million people to get from the Blasted Lands through the Dark Portal and into the Burning Crusade. Enter patch 2.0.3, simply titled The Burning Crusade. The player bottleneck this created was absolutely massive. World of Warcraft had been successful beyond belief. So upon midnight releases across the world, people queued in their often cold January weather at their local game shop to pick up a copy of World of Warcraft's first expansion. Getting home with supplies to play for the whole weekend, you installed the several discs, you logged in, and then it hit you. Your entire server, Horde and Alliance were in the Blasted Lands. This was in the days before layering or sharding or any technology to separate players up artificially. If there were 1,000 players in a zone, there were 1,000 players in a zone. You'd have been lucky to have anything better than a single digit of FPS. The game lagged behind incredibly, of course, and PvP servers were a thing, don't forget. You'd have had people ganking others trying to get through the portal. It was definitely a legendary moment to have been there, but it was also a bit of a learning point for Blizzard. Don't send all your players through the same gate at the same time, which is why in expansions like Wrath, for example, you could start in the Borean Tundra or Howling Fjord, Cataclysm, Vashj'ir or Hyjal, Pandaria opposite ends of the Jade Forest. Horde and Alliance were also split too when they accessed these new zones. Once you were through the portal, things settled down rather fast as the player base spread out again. But for a moment, all 8 million WoW players were stuck getting through that dark portal. But the launch of an expansion pales before some of the things that Blizzard attempted to do in vanilla. Perhaps one of the most ambitious events to ever have taken place in World of Warcraft happened just after the release of patch 1.9, the Gates of Ahn'Qiraj. Now, unlike many of the patches we've gone over so far, the drama surrounding this patch didn't happen more or less straight away, but sometime after. Nowadays, a lot of people have played through and experienced what made opening the Gates of AQ such an epic event, and I guess you can only imagine the tasks set before players back in January of 2006. To open the gates, two main things need to happen. A player has to undergo a huge quest chain to obtain the Scepter of the Shifting Sands, and secondly, the war effort has to be completed, where literally millions of items must be handed in across both Horde and Alliance. Once the war effort part is done, there was a few days grace where story-wise the items were being transported over to Silithus, and after that any player with the Scepter was eligible to sound the gong outside of AQ on their server and to start the 10-hour war. Whilst these two parts leading up to the 10-hour war are epic in their own right, this event is what truly broke servers. So when the war effort was done, you had the Scepter and you banged the gong, the AQ event will begin on your server specifically, and defenders would pour out to attack any player characters awaiting outside. This spawned in tons of elite enemies, and so many players and mobs clashed in battle, the servers absolutely could not handle it. We've already talked about how back then they didn't have any tech to split players up when there was a lot of them in the same zone, and this was very much the same situation. And you better believe everyone on your server during those 10 hours were logged in and in Silithus doing battle with the Anubisaf, Silithid and other defenders of AQ. People would report having the game crash and logging back in to find themselves in Westfall Graveyard bizarrely, or even in the Stone Talon Mountains. These were some suspected failsafe respawn points within the game. What the developers tried to do here retrospectively was just absolutely crazy, and there was no way it was ever going to work well, and you have to respect them for taking that step and creating something truly memorable. Re-experiencing the opening of AQ on Classic Realms was once again something to behold, and even with our layering tech these days, the servers still absolutely couldn't handle it. So I guess in that sense, we did get to enjoy the authentic Classic experience. The opening of the Gates of AQ were a unique moment in World of Warcraft's history, and not something to soon be repeated. It was so ambitious in scale, the game simply couldn't handle it, and that remained true some 20 years later, and that's why it's making this video. Next up, we have something a bit more modern. In fact, this is the most recent patch to World of Warcraft in this entire list. So far, we've seen game updates that broke the game for both the right and the wrong reasons, but this is entirely something else. This is the unnamed patch 1.15.2 of Season of Discovery, aka SOD Phase 3. So, Season of Discovery got off to an incredible start. I don't really think you can argue with that. Vanilla with class updates, new content, new stuff to find. Sounds great, sign me right up. Spamming the Black Fathoms Deep raid, checking out all the runes, getting every class to 25, it was a really great time. Then Phase 2 came about and it was okay. An updated Gnomeregan, that's not everyone's favourite dungeon, and some of these runes are starting to take a while to get. So Phase 3 had some work to do to get players reinvested in this fresh vanilla experience. And one of the key new pieces of content in Phase 3 would be Nightmare Incursions, a PvE themed event where you fight off forces of the Nightmare and earn various rewards. The first red flag came in advance of the patch dropping when we heard that Nightmare Invasions had taken inspiration from the Cenarian Hold Rat farm in Silithus. Now vanilla did many things right, but some things such as the old ranking system or the, Cenarian Hold Rat farm were not things I could get behind doing again. And then the content came out for Nightmare Incursions and, well, where do I start? People who played the launch of Phase 3 racked up hundreds of gold in a matter of a few hours, as the rewards for these short repeatable quests were just far too good. People logged in the morning when it had already been nerfed and felt cheated out of tons of gold, and gold still mattered big time in vanilla, so this was already a poor start to this new event. Nightmare Incursions also blew every single other way of leveling out of the water. Nothing else felt worth doing. It also introduced new very well itemized gear, or at least very well itemized if you didn't do too much BFD, and these items were great for every class and spec. The mob density in the incursions was insane, and it was difficult to make your way through without getting dazed. There were these mobs that will wait until you cast a spell and then spell lock you. If you think about it, you'll notice how Blizzard pretty much never puts ranged interrupts on enemies for exactly this reason. The Cenarian Hold folder system for obtaining quests was incredibly clunky and user unfriendly. Add-ons and weak auras were quickly developed to auto-delete bad quests and share the good ones though. Only one group per layer could start the escort quests, and the entire rest of the server on that layer had to go an AFK by the end of the ramp for them to hand in so they could get quest credit. Who thought this up? Some mobs just hit unreasonably hard and would make Defias pillagers even look weak in comparison. There were wisps that would chase you down and dismount you in addition to doing about a third of your health. The list just goes on and on and on. At least there weren't mob tags on named elites though. Maybe that's the one redeeming feature I can think of. But the launch of Phase 3 and Incursions were honestly a bit of a disaster for Season of Discovery, despite it more recently improving a lot with Karazhan, the Rune Vendor and so on. But Phase 3 of Season of Discovery is definitely worthy of third place here. At the number 2 spot we're staying in a vanilla setting for perhaps one of the most well-known events in WoW history. So well known it's even made the news in real life. This took place during patch 1.7, Rise of the Blood God. Little did they know how true this patch name would end up being. On September 13th, a brand new raid was introduced, Zul'Gurub, and during the final boss, Hakar, he casts an ability called Corrupted Blood. This does damage over time to the affected player as well as a small AoE around them, and most importantly, if that player stands too close to somebody else, they will also get this debuff. The idea of this is in the fight you need to be careful with your positioning and making sure that the afflicted player is practicing some good old social distancing. But what happened when ZG first released is that Corrupted Blood would also affect pets. So if a pet got the debuff and was dismissed, it would retain that debuff until re-summoned. So the idea then is pretty simple. Go Hakar, get debuff on pet, dismiss pet, go to super high populated area such as vendors during holiday events, the auction house and so on, re-summon your pet and watch as the Corrupted Blood spreads like wildfire to all nearby players and NPCs in a matter of seconds. And once the debuff was out there, it was kind of impossible to get rid of it. Accidentally or on purpose, players would be spreading it about, and again NPCs could get it too. Those wandering guards in capital cities started to become plague spreaders. Things got so impossibly out of hand due to this debuff making populated zones impossible to traverse that Blizzard had to do a hard reset on all servers to clear the remaining debuffs. And Blizzard, outside of maintenance, really never do this. This debuff and its spread was even used as research on the effect of real-world epidemics, such was its impact within the game. The Corrupted Blood incident is without a doubt one of the most famous moments in all of WoW history, and when it comes to something going very wrong, it's kind of hard to beat. But there is one patch which absolutely clears everything else in terms of how wrong it went. One defining moment. There has never been a more utterly disastrous patch in World of Warcraft than 6.0.3a Warlords of Draenor. This was the release patch for Warlords of Draenor, WoW's 5th expansion, and seemingly a return to more traditional WoW values of big orcs and killing demons. A huge part of this expansion, and something that every player had to undergo as their entry to Draenor, was the introduction to their garrison. A kind of player housing type thing where the player had their own base and was able to build it up, recruit followers, do missions and so on. And this is where the issues started to happen. The sheer volume of players returning for WoD hyped off the intro cinematic was insane, and Blizzard just weren't ready for this number of players to try and access the game all at the same time. Blizzard also commented on DDoS attacks happening at the same time as the launch, which are of course out of their control, but will always massively impact the game. But at the end of the day, when there's a fresh expansion in front of you and the game just won't load, it's always going to be frustrating. Tons of people also got bottlenecked in their garrisons as part of the introductory quest. And with each and every player having their own instance version of the world active, I think you can imagine why this could have caused problems, with literally millions of instances being created in the space of a few hours. It wasn't uncommon for some players to be legitimately stuck for several days in a row at the start of Warlords of Draenor. They were unable to log in, unable to use any unstuck function, and your time off work or school was wasted just so you could look at a login screen. It was by far the worst expansion launch this game has ever seen, and between the DDoS attacks and other issues preventing players from getting into the game, I don't think a scenario like this could really happen again on this scale. I do also know a lot of people didn't have the same issues during WoD launch and got straight in, but in terms of impact for the affected players, I don't think anything has gone more wrong than this for more players, and that's why the launch of Warlords of Draenor for me has to be the most disastrous patch in World of Warcraft's history. And that is it. I did try and pick a bit of variety of patches. Again, it wasn't just about the patch being poorly received, but the scope of how wrong things went during it really. Let me know if you think there are any other moments throughout World of Warcraft's history that would have been worth a mention here in the comments down below. And finally, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I'll see you on the next one very soon.